"That child is digging her own grave," Rutherford Polk said, loud enough for everyone in the general store to hear. He stood behind his counter with his arms crossed and his chin lifted in the particular way of a man who believes his own experience makes him incapable of error. 6 months later, that same man would kneel in the snow outside a stone door carved into a cliff face, begging to be let inside. But on that September morning in 1888, Rutherford Polk knew nothing of what was coming. None of them did. Only one person in Coldwater Ridge, Montana territory had seen the signs. Only one person had read what the land was trying to tell them. And that person was 13 years old, standing at the edge of town with a wool blanket, a small sack of cornmeal, a hunting knife with a worn oak handle, and a border collie named Thistle pressed against her leg. Marin Ashby was small for her age. Her dark hair hung in a single braid down her back, and her face carried an expression that most adults found difficult to look at for long. It held certainty, the kind that sits in the eyes of someone who has seen something that others refuse to see. Behind her, the people of Coldwater Ridge watched from doorways and windows. No one waved. No one called out a word of comfort or farewell. The town council had voted the night before, and the town council had decided. Now the town stood in collective silence as a 13-year-old girl was sent into the wilderness to face whatever the wilderness chose to do with her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt road. The aspens on the surrounding hills had just begun to turn, their leaves catching the light like scattered coins. It looked, from a distance, like a painting of everything a frontier town was supposed to be. Peaceful, prosperous, safe. No one in that painting knew that this was the last warm day they would feel for 6 months. Marin's eyes moved across the faces she could see. She found Dorothea Creel standing behind the curtain of her boarding house window, the woman's hand gripping the fabric so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. For 5 months, Dorothea had kept Marin in the back room of that boarding house. She had fed her until the sharp angles of the girl's face softened. She had taught her to sew properly with a thimble and good thread. She had let her sleep in a real bed with a real pillow, and had not complained when Marin woke before dawn every morning to stand at the window, watching the sky as though it were telling her something. And then, at 2 o'clock in the morning while Marin slept, Dorothea had signed the paper that Pastor Fenimore brought to her door. The paper that said this child was unfit to live among decent people. The paper that said she must be cast out before her corruption spread. Marin watched Dorothea's lips move behind the glass, forming words that her voice refused to carry. For one moment, the girl thought the woman might call out, might say something, might do the thing she had failed to do in the darkness of the night before when it still could have mattered. But Dorothea's hand released the curtain, and the fabric fell back into place, and her face disappeared behind it, like a stone dropped into dark water. Marin looked away. She found Amos Kincaid standing near the fence at the edge of his property, 67 years old, his hat held in both hands against his chest. His weathered face was turned downward so that his eyes met the dirt beneath his boots, instead of the girl walking away from everything she had known. Amos Kincaid had run sheep on these hills for 40 years. He had survived droughts and blizzards and the kind of loneliness that settles into a man's bones when he spends too many winters alone with his flock. He was the kind of man who called himself self-reliant, who believed that a person's worth was measured by their willingness to face hard things directly. But he was not facing this directly. He was looking at the ground. Marin saw him. She understood. Even courage has its limits. Amos Kincaid had found his. Near the general store, Agnes Whitaker leaned toward another woman and whispered something that made them both shake their heads. Marin did not need to hear the words. She had heard them before, spoken in different combinations, but always with the same meaning. Strange child, touched in the head. Bad blood from that grandfather of hers. Poor thing. Better for everyone if she just disappears. On the steps of the white clapboard church, Pastor Josiah Fenimore stood with his Bible pressed against his chest. He was 55 years old, with silver hair and eyes the color of creek water in winter. Cold, clear, absolutely certain of their own righteousness. He had come to Coldwater Ridge 8 years earlier, though few people knew the full story of why. He had been a minister in St. Louis, attached to a respectable congregation, until a dispute over matters of authority had ended with his quiet removal. The official language was reassignment. The unofficial truth was that Josiah Fenimore could not tolerate any voice in his congregation louder than his own. He had come west to rebuild. In Coldwater Ridge, a small town with no established church, he had found the blank canvas he needed. Within 3 years, he was the moral authority of the settlement, the man whose approval you sought and whose disapproval you feared. Marin Ashby had challenged that authority simply by existing, a child who claimed to know things that no child should know, a girl who spoke with certainty about matters that were supposed to belong to God and to the men who interpreted God's will. Every time she opened her mouth, Fenimore felt the ground shift beneath his pulpit. Now he watched her go with an expression of grim satisfaction. The problem had been solved. The danger had been removed. Order had been restored. He did not know that in 5 months he would be found frozen in the front pew of his own church, his Bible open on his lap, the cellar beneath the altar empty of the food he had hoarded, while his congregation starved. But that was later. That was winter. This was still autumn, and the sun was still warm, and Marin Ashby was still walking. She turned north. Thistle walked beside her, the dog's black and white fur catching the morning light. The border collie was young, perhaps 2 years old, with one ear that stood straight up and one that flopped forward, as though it could never quite decide what it wanted to be. Marin had found her as a puppy, abandoned in a ditch at the edge of town, half-starved and shivering. She had nursed the dog back to health with scraps from Dorothea's kitchen and patience that seemed endless. Now Thistle was the only living creature walking beside her into the wilderness. At the edge of town, where the road turned to trail, 3 figures waited. Amos Kincaid had left his spot by the fence and circled around through the back streets to reach this point before her. His face was wet with tears that carved channels through the creased leather of his cheeks. He held out a small canvas sack, and when Marin took it, she found fishing line, hooks, a flint striker, and a piece of good tanned leather. "Your grandfather," Amos said, and his voice broke on the word. "Ezra would be ashamed of me. I saw every sign you saw. I knew you were right. I was too much of a coward to say so." Marin looked up at him, 13 years old, carrying everything she owned, standing at the edge of a town that had just declared her unfit to live among them. Her eyes held the same look they always held, that steady, unblinking certainty that made adults want to turn away. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, "my grandfather told me that knowing the right thing and not doing it is worse than not knowing at all." The old man nodded. He had nothing left to say. He put his hat back on his head and stood there, diminished, as though the act of not speaking up had physically reduced him. Behind him, Whitfield Braxton stepped forward. Everyone called him Whit. He was 16 years old with his mother's sharp cheekbones and his father's broad shoulders. His father had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier, and since then, Whit had been learning what it meant to be the man of a house, where the real power still belonged to his mother, Cordelia. Cordelia Braxton had been the first to raise her hand at the town meeting, the first to vote for Marin's exile. Her face had shown no hesitation, no conflict, no doubt. She had raised her hand the way she gave orders to ranch hands, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never had reason to question whether she might be wrong. Whit had not raised his hand. He had sat beside his mother and watched her vote. And then he had looked across the room at Marin, and something had passed between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a thread that would hold through the months ahead when everything else came apart. Now he held out a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "I'm sorry," he said. Marin took the bread. She looked at the boy who had not raised his hand. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just remember." The third figure was old Bridget Morrigan, 71 years old with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and hands gnarled by decades of hard work. She had come to Montana from Ireland 40 years ago with her husband, who had died in the same mining accident that killed Whit's father. She had stayed because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but stay. She pressed a small cloth pouch into Marin's hands. "Salt," she said. Her accent still carried the music of County Clare. "In Ireland, we read the land too. We listened to what the earth was telling us. You're right, child. I'm too old to fight Fenimore, but I know you're right." Marin tucked the salt into her pack alongside the cornmeal and the fishing supplies. She looked at the three people who had come to see her off, the old man who had failed to speak, the boy who had chosen not to vote, the woman who believed her but could not protect her. It was not much, but it was not nothing. "Thank you," she said. Then she turned and walked north, and she did not look back. Looking back was for people who had something to return to. If you were Marin right now, 13 years old, cast out by everyone you know, walking into the wilderness with nothing but a knife and a dog, what would you be feeling? Take a moment. Put yourself in her shoes. And if you've ever felt that kind of alone, that kind of abandoned, let me know in the comments below. To understand why an entire town would send a child into the wilderness, you have to understand what that child had said and what she had been saying for longer than anyone wanted to remember. But before that, you have to understand where she came from. You have to understand Ezra. Ezra Ashby was not the kind of man that towns produce. He was the kind of man that mountains produce. Quiet and watchful and more comfortable in the company of stone than in the company of people. He had been born in Cornwall, England, in the mining village of St. Just, where the cliffs plunged into the Atlantic and the wind never stopped blowing. His family had lived in those cliffs for generations, not in houses, but in caves. Dwellings carved from the granite by hands that understood stone, the way a farmer understands soil, the way a sailor understands the sea. Ezra's grandfather had taught him. His grandfather's father had taught him. The knowledge passed down through generations like an inheritance more valuable than money. How to read the grain of rock, how to find the natural fractures that made carving possible, how to use the Earth's own temperature, which stayed constant at 54 degrees year-round, to survive winters that killed men in wooden houses. He had come to America as a young man, seeking something he could never quite name. He had served as an army scout in the territories, learning the land the way he had learned the cliffs of Cornwall, by walking it, by sleeping on it, by paying attention to what it was trying to tell him. He had settled in Montana territory in his 40s, married a woman named Clara, who died giving birth to their only child, and raised his daughter alone in a cabin he built with his own hands. When that daughter grew up and married a man named Thomas Ashby, Ezra had welcomed the union. When his daughter died 3 years later of a fever that swept through the territory, Ezra had buried her beside Clara and taken his granddaughter Marin to raise. Marin was 6 years old when she went to live with Ezra. She was 11 when he died. In those 5 years, he taught her everything he knew. He taught her to read the land. When she was 7, he took her to a ridge above the Sweetwater River and pointed to a grove of aspens where a Steller's jay was burying acorns in the soft earth. It was the middle of July. The sun was high and hot, and the grass was green, and there was no reason in the visible world to think about winter. "Watch the bird," Ezra said. Marin watched. The jay worked with frantic energy that seemed out of place in the lazy warmth of summer, burying acorn after acorn, moving with the desperate efficiency of a creature racing against a clock that only it could hear. "When birds start storing too early," Ezra said. "You know what they're saying?" Marin shook her head. "They're saying don't trust the summer." 3 months later, the earliest blizzard in memory swept down from the north and buried the territory under 2 feet of snow. But Ezra had listened to the jay. He had already moved them to lower ground, already stocked enough dried meat and firewood to last a month. They survived because a bird had told them what was coming, and Ezra had been willing to believe it. "The animals always know," he told Marin, sitting beside the fire while the storm howled outside. "They don't have opinions about the weather. They don't have pride. They just feel what's coming, and they act. People are different. People would rather be comfortable than prepared. Remember that." Marin remembered. That same year, on a sandstone cliff overlooking a valley full of wildflowers, Ezra showed her something else. He took his hunting knife, the one with the worn oak handle that fit his palm, like it had been carved for no other hand, and he pressed the blade into a seam in the rock. He rotated the blade 45 degrees, applying steady pressure, and a thin slab of sandstone separated from the cliff face and fell to the ground in a clean piece. "Sandstone is softer than you'd think," he said, handing her the knife. "But harder than you'd expect. Like people, that way." He guided her hand, showing her the angle, the pressure, the patience required. He carved a small shelf into the rock face, deep enough to hold a tin cup. When he was finished, he set his cup on it and stepped back to admire the work. "If you ever need a home," he said, "and there's no one to give you one, you build it yourself. Wood rots, canvas tears, but stone holds. And stone holds heat longer than anything else. Remember that, too." Marin remembered everything. One evening, when the fire had burned down to embers, and the stars above the mountains were so thick they looked like spilled flour on a dark table, Marin asked a question that had been sitting in her chest for as long as she could recall. "Grandfather, what if someday I'm all alone?" Ezra was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. An owl called from somewhere in the pines. "Then you build yourself a place," he said. "Doesn't have to be big, just has to be warm." He put his arm around her and pulled her close. "But here's the other thing, little bird. Someday you're going to say something true, and the whole world is going to call you a liar. When that day comes, you remember that the mountain still hears you. The ground still hears you. And your grandfather, wherever he is, still hears you." Marin was 7 years old when he said that. She did not fully understand it then. She was 11 years old when Ezra Ashby died. It happened in the cabin, which was a mercy. The sickness had been in his lungs for months, and he had known it was coming, the way he knew everything was coming, by paying attention to the signs. He had spent his last weeks teaching Marin everything he hadn't yet taught her, making sure she had the knife, the knowledge, the will to survive. On the last night, with his breath rattling in his chest and his hand growing cold in hers, he had looked at her with eyes that were already seeing somewhere else. "The land remembers," he whispered, "even when people forget." Those were his last words. Marin buried him behind the cabin, in a grave she dug with his own knife. The oak handle fit her small palm imperfectly, the blade biting into the rocky soil one scrape at a time. It took her most of a day. When it was deep enough, she lowered his body into it and covered him with earth and stones and said the only prayer she knew, which was not a prayer at all, but something Ezra used to say when he saw something beautiful in the mountains. The land remembers. She did not cry. This was not because she was hard or cold or incapable of grief. It was because Ezra had taught her that tears were for when you were safe. In the wild, crying blurs your eyes, and blurred eyes get you killed. So Maren held her tears. She held them the way you hold a breath underwater, knowing that eventually you will have to surface. But not yet. Not here. Not while there was still work to do. She walked south toward Coldwater Ridge, the nearest settlement, hoping to find some kind of life among people. Coldwater Ridge did not know what to make of her. A wild child appearing from the mountains in the autumn of 1886, speaking of a dead grandfather without shedding a tear, carrying a knife, and the unsettling calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to them. The townspeople took her in the way you take in a stray dog that shows up on your porch in a rainstorm. Not because you want it, but because turning it away feels like something you would have to answer for later. She was passed from household to household. The Hendersons kept her for 3 weeks before Mrs. Henderson declared that the girl gave her an uneasy feeling. The Polks lasted a month before their twins complained that Maren stared at things too long and never laughed at anything. The Harshaws took her for 2 weeks, during which Dr. Clement Harshaw told his wife that the girl exhibited signs of juvenile hysteria and would be better suited to an institution in Helena. Maren worked for her keep at every house. She scrubbed floors without being asked. She mended clothes with small, precise stitches that Dorothea Creel would later say were better than her own. She tended livestock with a competence that startled the men who watched her handle horses and sheep as though she had been born in a barn instead of on a mountainside. But she never softened, never became the grateful, pliable orphan they expected. She remained Maren, quiet, watchful, certain. Dorothea Creel kept her the longest, 5 months in the back room of the boarding house, and those 5 months were the closest thing to home that Maren experienced in Coldwater Ridge. Dorothea was a widow, childless now since diphtheria had taken her daughter 8 years earlier. She saw something in Maren that the other families had been too uncomfortable to look at long enough to recognize. She saw a child. Dorothea taught Maren to sew properly with a thimble and good thread. She fed her until the sharp angles of the girl's face softened slightly. She let her sleep in a real bed with a real pillow. And she did not complain when Maren woke before dawn every morning and stood at the window, watching the sky as though it were telling her something. But Dorothea also understood Coldwater Ridge in ways that Maren did not. "You have to stop saying the strange things," she told her one evening, her voice gentle but firm. "The things about the weather and the animals. People here are afraid of what they don't understand. And when people are afraid, they get mean." Maren looked at the woman who had been kinder to her than anyone since Ezra. She considered the warning. She weighed it against everything her grandfather had taught her about the cost of silence. "Mrs. Creel," she said, "if you stay quiet when you know the truth, then the quiet itself becomes a lie." Dorothea had no answer for that. Maren had warned Coldwater Ridge twice before the final warning, and twice Coldwater Ridge had refused to listen. The first time was spring of 1887, when she told the men at the livery stable that the snowpack in the high country was melting too fast, and that Willow Creek would flood within the week. They dismissed her as a child, playing at prophecy. 3 horses drowned when the creek rose 6 feet in a single night. The second time was August of 1888, when she told Amos Kincaid that frost was coming early, that she had seen the signs in the way the ground squirrels were behaving, and that he should harvest his vegetable garden immediately. Old Amos had listened politely, the way you listen to a child who tells you about an imaginary friend, and done nothing. The frost came 4 days later. The garden was destroyed. After the frost, Cordelia Braxton paid a visit to Dorothea Creel's boarding house. She did not come inside. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and delivered her message with the efficiency of a woman who is accustomed to being obeyed. "Keep the girl quiet," she said. "My late husband built half this town. If she keeps spreading panic, I'll petition the council to remove her permanently." That evening, Dorothea sat beside Marin on the bed in the back room. She took the girl's hand. "You heard what Mrs. Braxton said. You have to stop, Marin. You have to be quiet." Marin pulled her hand away. "Mrs. Creel," she said, "staying quiet when you know the truth. That is the real lie." Dorothea closed her eyes. She knew the girl was right. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming when you feel the pressure drop in your bones. But knowing something and acting on it are two different things. In the distance between them is where cowardice lives. In September of 1888, the signs came again. Marin saw them everywhere. Every animal in the territory was telling the same story, and every sign pointed in the same direction. She had never seen so many warnings arrive at once. So loud, so urgent, so impossible to ignore. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. She stood in the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by women buying flour and men discussing cattle prices, and she spoke. "The winter is coming early. It will be the worst winter anyone has ever seen. The snow will bury the houses. The cold will kill the cattle. You have to prepare now, or many of you will die." Rutherford Polk laughed from behind his counter. "That child is digging her own grave," he announced. "I've lived here 31 years. Never seen a winter come before December," the women whispered. The men shook their heads. Dr. Clement Harshaw, who happened to be purchasing tobacco, adjusted his spectacles and offered his professional opinion. "Classic juvenile hysteria," he said, "manifesting as apocalyptic delusion. Quite common in orphans who lack proper supervision." Agnes Whitaker leaned toward her companion. "Poor thing," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The madness ran in that grandfather of hers. Blood tells, doesn't it?" Klaus Webermann, a German miner who had been purchasing supplies near the back of the store, set down his goods and turned to look at the girl. He had seen winters like the one she described. In Bavaria, when he was a boy, such winters had taken whole villages. He had seen the same signs she was describing: the animals hoarding too early, the frost patterns on the windows, the particular color of the sunset that the old people always said meant death was coming. He opened his mouth to speak, to say that the girl might be right, that in his country they had learned to listen to such warnings. But Rutherford Polk was already laughing again, and the other men were shaking their heads, and Klaus Webermann was a foreigner with a thick accent who had learned long ago that his opinions were not welcome in rooms where American-born men were speaking. He closed his mouth. He picked up his supplies. He walked out of the store without saying a word. He would regret that silence for the rest of his life. That evening, Pastor Josiah Fenimore ascended to his pulpit. "No child could know such things," he thundered, his voice filling the small church with the resonance of absolute conviction. "This is the work of darkness. The girl is either possessed by forces of evil, or she is simply wicked, spreading fear for the devil's amusement. She must be cast out before her corruption spreads to our children, to our homes, to our very souls," the congregation murmured. Heads nodded. Fear does that. It finds a target and it nods. That night, after the service, Fenimore walked to Dorothea Creel's boarding house. He stood in the doorway of the back room where Marin slept, her small body curled beneath a quilt that Dorothea had made for her own daughter years ago. Fenimore watched the girl sleep for a long moment. Then he turned to Dorothea. "I need you to sign a statement," he said. confirming that the child is not right, that she is disturbed, that she needs to be removed for the safety of the community. Dorothea looked at Maren sleeping. She looked at the quilt. She looked at the small, calloused hands resting on the pillow, hands that had dug a grave and set snares and mended clothes and done every task that had ever been asked of them without complaint. Then she looked at Fenimore, at the certainty in his face, at the power that stood behind him like a shadow with weight. Her hand trembled as she signed. The vote was held the following morning in the church. It was not really a vote. It was a performance, a ritual confirmation of a decision that had already been made in the darkness of the night before. Fenimore stood at the front. He presented his case. He used words like corruption and darkness and the safety of our children. Each word landed like a nail driven into wood. Cordelia Braxton raised her hand first. Her face showed no hesitation, no conflict, no doubt. Behind her, Rutherford Polk raised his hand with a satisfied nod. Dr. Harshaw raised his hand while polishing his spectacles. Agnes Whitaker raised her hand and leaned toward her neighbor to whisper something that made them both smile. Only 3 people in that church did not raise their hands to vote for the exile. Whit Braxton, sitting beside his mother, kept his hands in his lap and stared straight ahead. Old Bridget Morrigan, in the back row, sat with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her Irish eyes burning with a fury that she was too old and too alone to act upon. And Klaus Weberman, standing near the door, shook his head slowly and walked out before the vote was complete. He could not stop what was happening, but he would not participate in it either. After the vote, Amos Kincaid walked behind the church, stood alone in the shadow of the building where no one could see him, and drove his fist into the wooden wall so hard that the skin split across his knuckles. The bruise that formed would stay with him for weeks. He would carry it like a mark, a visible reminder of the invisible failure it represented. The next morning, Maren woke to find Dorothea already up, standing at the kitchen stove with her back turned. The woman did not look at her, did not turn around, did not offer breakfast or conversation or any of the small kindnesses that had made the past 5 months bearable. Maren understood without being told. She recognized the shape of betrayal in the rigid line of Dorothea's shoulders, in the way the woman's hands gripped the edge of the stove, as though holding herself upright against a wind that only she could feel. Maren folded the blanket. She picked up the small sack of cornmeal that Dorothea had set on the table. She took the hunting knife from beneath her pillow, the one with the worn oak handle, the blade still sharp from the last time she had honed it on a river stone. She walked to the door. Thistle rose from her spot by the cold fireplace and padded over to stand beside her. Dorothea did not turn around. Neither of them spoke. There are silences that say more than words ever could. This was one of them. The silence of a woman who had chosen safety over love, and a girl who had learned once more that the people who care about you and the people who protect you are not always the same people. Maren stepped outside into the September morning, and she did not look back. The first night alone in the wilderness, Maren Ashby learned something that Ezra had never taught her. She learned what it feels like when the entire world forgets you exist. She had walked north for most of the day, following the foothills, where the sagebrush flats gave way to rocky ground, and the land began its slow climb toward the peaks. She ate her cornmeal in small pinches, letting each one dissolve on her tongue before swallowing. She drank from a creek so cold it made her teeth ache. Thistle walked beside her, occasionally ranging ahead to investigate a scent, always circling back to check on her. When the sun dropped behind the western ridgeline and the temperature fell with it, Maren wrapped herself in the wool blanket beneath a fallen pine and tried to sleep. The cold was worse than she had expected. This was not the sharp, honest cold of the high mountains where she had camped with Ezra, where they had always had a fire and each other's warmth and the knowledge that they were together. This was a different kind of cold, the cold of absence, the cold that seeps in when there is no one beside you, no one ahead of you on the trail, no one in the world who knows where you are or whether you are still breathing. Thistle pressed against her side, the dog's warmth a small mercy in the vastness of the night. Maren lay on the frozen ground and shivered so violently that her jaw clenched and her muscles cramped and her body curled tighter and tighter into itself, as though trying to become small enough to disappear. The blanket was not enough. The night was not done with her. And somewhere in the long dark hours between midnight and dawn, the thing she had been holding since she was 11 years old finally broke loose. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding it for 2 years, and the holding itself has become heavier than the grief it was containing. She cried for Ezra, whose grave she had dug alone. She cried for Dorothea, who had signed a piece of paper that weighed more than any stone. She cried for the life she had tried to build in Coldwater Ridge, the careful, quiet hope that she might belong somewhere, anywhere, that had been dismantled in a single morning by people who feared her more than they feared the winter she had warned them about. Thistle licked her face. The dog did not understand tears, but she understood distress, and she pressed closer, her warm body a living comfort against the cold. The crying lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then it stopped. Not because the grief was finished, but because Maren made it stop. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She took 3 long breaths, and she spoke aloud to the darkness, to the trees, to whatever part of Ezra might still be listening in the cold Montana night. All right, that's enough. She did not cry again, not during the weeks of back-breaking labor that followed, not during the long nights alone, not when the snow came and the world turned white and silent and merciless. She had given herself 5 minutes. 5 minutes was all the wilderness would allow. In the silence that followed, lying awake with her blanket pulled to her chin and Thistle curled against her side, a memory surfaced. Ezra crouching beside a fire when she was 6, his arms around her while the wind screamed outside, her own voice small and frightened. Grandfather, what if someday I'm all alone? And his answer, the answer she had carried without fully understanding, now returning to her with the force of a commandment. Then you build yourself a place. Doesn't have to be big, just has to be warm. Maren opened her eyes. She stopped shivering. She knew what she had to find. On the second day, she found it. The cliff face rose 40 feet above a small valley, where a spring seeped from the rocks and fed a narrow stream lined with willows. The stone was red gold sandstone, layered and fractured by centuries of frost and thaw, with a natural overhang that jutted out like a roof over the base of the cliff. Below the overhang, partially hidden by a tangle of dead brush, a crack ran back into the rock. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a child's body to squeeze through, but it opened into a cavity within the stone, a natural pocket roughly 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for Maren to stand upright. She pressed her palm against the interior wall. The stone was warm, not hot, not even close, but warmer than the air outside by a margin that mattered. Maren closed her eyes and remembered. The earth keeps its own temperature, Ezra had told her once, standing in a cave in the high country. About 54 degrees, year-round. It doesn't matter if it's summer or winter, above ground. Down here, in the earth, it's always 54 degrees. Find a place where water runs underground, and you'll find where the warmth of the earth rises closest to the surface. She opened her eyes and looked at the spring seeping from the rocks, water running underground, carrying geothermal heat from deep in the earth, and the rock had absorbed that warmth the way a body absorbs sunlight. Maren smiled. It was the first time her face had made that shape since the morning she walked out of Dorothea Creel's boarding house. "I found it, grandfather," she whispered. "I found it." The first week was the worst. She worked from first light until her arms shook and her hands could no longer grip the knife. She widened the entrance inch by inch, scraping and chipping at the sandstone with the blade, remembering the angle and the pressure and the patience. 45 degrees. Steady pressure. Let the stone separate along its own grain. When the blade chipped on the third day, striking a vein of harder rock embedded in the softer stone, her stomach dropped. The knife was the only precision tool she had, the only thing Ezra had left behind. She sat on the ground and stared at the damaged edge and felt the weight of what it meant. Then she stood up. She spent half a day at the creek, grinding the blade against a flat river stone in long, careful strokes until the edge returned. Not as sharp as before, but sharp enough. She learned that she could not simply attack the rock. She had to read it. Find the grain. Work with the stone instead of against it. She began using flat stones as primary chisels, saving the knife for detail work. She fashioned crude hammers from creek cobbles, lashed to sticks, with strips torn from the edge of her blanket. Her hands blistered. The blisters broke. The raw skin beneath bled and stung, and then slowly began to thicken into calluses that would never fully soften. By the end of the first week, her palms looked like they belonged to a woman twice her age who had spent her life working leather. She gathered materials as she went. Deadfall from the valley floor became firewood, stacked in bundles she could carry on her back. Dry grass from the meadow became bedding. She carved a fire pit near the entrance, where a natural crack in the ceiling drew smoke upward and out through the rock, creating a chimney she had not had to build because the mountain had built it for her over thousands of years. Pine nuts, rose hips from the wild bushes along the creek, roots that could be roasted in coals. She set snares for rabbits and caught her first one on the fourth day. She skinned it, cooked the meat, and scraped the hide with a flat stone to begin the slow process of curing fur she would need before the cold deepened. Thistle learned to help. The dog was a herder by instinct, and she took to the work of hunting with an enthusiasm that surprised Maren. She would flush rabbits from the brush, driving them toward the snares, and then sit beside the catch, with her tongue lolling and her tail wagging as though expecting praise. Maren always gave it. "Good girl," she would say, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Good girl, Thistle. We're going to make it. You and me. We're going to make it." She wasn't entirely alone. On the fifth morning, a red fox appeared at the creek. It was a young male, lean and sharp-faced, with fur the color of old pennies. It drank from the water, raised its head, and looked directly at Maren, who was sitting on a rock 20 feet away, chewing a strip of dried rabbit. Neither of them moved. Neither of them ran. Thistle growled low in her throat, but Maren put a hand on the dog's back to quiet her. The fox finished drinking, sat down on its haunches, and watched her work for the better part of an hour before trotting back into the brush. It came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Maren named it Copper. It never let her touch it. It never came closer than 15 feet. But it was there, a steady orange presence at the edge of her days, and for a child who had been abandoned by every human being she had ever trusted, the company of a creature who simply chose to be near her was worth more than she could have explained. By October, the cavity had become a room, 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall at the peak. The walls were smooth where she had carved them, the floor level and clean. The fire pit warmed the space with an efficiency that still surprised her each evening when she sealed the entrance and felt the stone begin to give back the heat it had stored all day. A small alcove in the rear wall held her growing supplies: bundles of dried rabbit, pouches of pine nuts and rose hips, roots packed in dry grass, firewood stacked tight against the back wall. She built a door from fallen aspens, lashed together with rawhide strips, and fitted into a frame she had carved into the stone entrance. She made a bolt from a thick branch, trimmed and fitted so it could be slid into a channel from within, locking the entrance against anything that came from outside. She was building something no 13-year-old should have had to build, and she was building it well. Then, in the middle of October, the wilderness sent her a different kind of test. Not cold, not hunger. Something worse. She was checking her snare line along the creek when she heard footsteps. Heavy. Human. Coming from the south. The man who emerged from the brush was not from Coldwater Ridge. He was perhaps 45 years old, heavy-set, with a matted beard and eyes that had the dull, restless look of someone who has been lost long enough to stop caring about being found. A miner, judging by his boots and the pan sticking out of his pack. His name was Silas Varn, and he had been wandering for 5 days without food. He saw the cliff. He saw the carved entrance. He saw the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney crack above. His expression changed in a way that Maren recognized instantly. She had seen it before, on the faces of people in Coldwater Ridge who looked at things they wanted and believed they deserved more than the person who had them. "Well now," Varn said, his voice carrying the forced friendliness of a man already calculating. "That's a fine setup you got there. Mighty fine for a kid out here on her own." Maren said nothing. Thistle moved to stand in front of her, hackles raised, a low growl building in her chest. "How about you let me stay the night?" Varn continued, moving closer. "I'll keep watch, protect you. A little girl out here alone, you need someone looking after you." He said, "Protect" the way Pastor Fenimore said salvation, as a word whose true meaning had nothing to do with the person it was aimed at. Maren understood the translation. She had spent 2 years in Coldwater Ridge, learning to hear the difference between what adults said and what adults meant. "No," she said. Varn stopped walking. His friendliness thinned. "Now listen here. I've been 5 days without a meal. That cave's got room for 2. You're being selfish is what you are. A man's asking nicely and you're being difficult." He took another step forward, then another. His size filled the space between them. His shadow fell over her. Maren drew the knife. The oak handle sat in her palm, with the familiarity of something she had held 10,000 times. The blade, slightly shorter now from the day she had mended it, caught the October light. Her hand did not shake. Her eyes did not waver. She had used this knife to bury her grandfather. She had used it to carve a home from solid rock. She could use it for this, too. "Step back," she said. "This is my home. I built it. You didn't. Leave." Thistle barked. Once. Sharp. A warning that needed no translation. Silas Varn looked at the knife. He looked at the dog. He looked at the girl's eyes. Something in them made him reconsider. The look of a person who has already lost everything, and therefore has nothing left to protect, except the thing they built from nothing. He stepped back. He swore under his breath. He called her a word that she had heard before and would hear again. And that meant nothing to her, because the opinion of a man like Silas Varn occupied no space in her mind. But before he turned to leave, he leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was no longer asking for anything. "I'll remember this place," he said. "And when winter gets bad enough, when you're starving and freezing and begging God for help, I'll be back. Count on it, little girl. I'll be back." Then he crashed back into the brush and was gone. Maren stood motionless until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Then her body began to tremble. not from fear, from anger. The hot, clean anger of someone whose sanctuary has been threatened by a person who did not build it and does not deserve it. That night, she reinforced the bolt on her door. She carved the channel deeper. She made the branch thicker. She had built walls and a roof and a fire. Now she built a lock, because winter would bring more than cold. It would bring desperation. And desperate people, she understood now, were more dangerous than any animal in these mountains. November brought Ghost. The Mustang appeared in the valley on a morning when frost had turned the grass white, and the willows along the creek looked like they had been dipped in sugar. She was a mare, young, with a coat the color of wood ash, and a mane so pale it seemed almost silver in the early light. She moved through the meadow with the cautious grace of a creature that had survived by trusting nothing and no one. Marin understood that feeling. She did not try to approach the mare on the first day, or the second, or the third. She sat on a rock near the creek with a handful of dried grass and simply existed in the horse's space, asking for nothing, offering nothing except stillness and patience. On the fourth day, the mare came closer. On the sixth, she took grass from a spot 5 feet from where Marin sat. On the 8th day, Marin stood slowly and extended her hand. The mare bolted. Not far, 30 yards, but far enough to make clear that trust for this animal would not be given cheaply. On the 9th day, Marin tried again. She walked toward the mare with grass in her outstretched hand, moving slowly, speaking softly. The mare watched. Her ears flicked forward, then back. Her nostrils flared, and then, without warning, she lashed out with a rear hoof that caught Marin square in the ribs and sent her sprawling in the frozen grass. The pain was immediate and enormous. Marin lay on her back, gasping, unable to draw a full breath. She assessed the damage with the calm Ezra had taught her. Badly bruised, not broken, but bruised in a way that would make every breath a small act of courage for the next several weeks. Thistle ran to her side, whimpering, licking her face. Marin did not give up. She returned the next morning, and the next. Each day a little closer, each day a little more grass, a little more quiet speech, a little more of the impossible patience that Ezra had shown her when he taught her to sit beside a beaver dam for 6 hours without moving, until the animals forgot she was there. On the 14th day, Ghost let Marin climb onto her back. The mare stood perfectly still as the girl settled her weight, as though something between them had finally been decided. Marin leaned forward and pressed her face against the warm curve of the horse's neck and breathed in the smell of animal heat and winter grass. Ghost made a sound, low and soft, almost a whisper. Marin named her for that sound. She carved a second chamber in the cliff, smaller than the first, and lined the floor with grass and pine boughs. Ghost's warmth filled the entire cave system at night, raising the temperature enough that Marin could sleep without her coat for the first time since September. And Ghost's presence provided something else, something Marin had not known she needed until she had it. The sound of another living creature breathing in the darkness, the knowledge that if she called out in the night, something would hear her. The sheep came next. Marin found them in a high meadow 2 miles east of her valley. 7 animals, thin and confused, clearly separated from a larger flock during some autumn movement she hadn't witnessed. 3 ewes, 3 lambs nearly grown, and a young ram with a broken horn. She thought of Amos Kincaid. The old man had run sheep on these hills for 40 years. She had watched him work during her time in Coldwater Ridge, had seen how he handled the animals, with a patience that seemed at odds with his otherwise gruff manner. She used what she had observed. Thistle, it turned out, was a natural herder. The border collie circled wide, keeping low, moving the sheep in the direction Marin indicated, with hand signals she invented on the spot. It took 3 days to move all 7 animals to her valley. She dug a third chamber into the cliff face, larger than Ghost's, but cruder in its construction. There was no time for smooth walls. Winter was coming, and the sheep needed shelter. She lined the floor with grass and deadfall. She built a barrier of branches and stones across the entrance that could be moved aside when she needed to let the animals out to graze, but would keep predators at bay when they were penned inside. The sheep provided more than she had anticipated. Their wool, which she could collect in handfuls from the rocks and brush where it caught, added warmth to her bedding. Their milk, which she learned to extract through trial and error from the more cooperative ewes, provided a source of protein that did not require hunting or snares. And their body heat, combined with Ghost's, raised the temperature of the connected cave system to something that almost felt comfortable. She was not just surviving now. She was building a home, a farm, a life. All of it carved from stone and silence and the refusal to die. Marin has survived 10 weeks alone in the wilderness now. She has built a home, tamed a wild horse, gathered a flock of sheep, and the real winter hasn't even begun. Do you think she's going to make it? Leave your prediction in the comments. Meanwhile, in Coldwater Ridge, the people who had sent her away continued living their lives as though nothing had changed. Rutherford Polk stood behind his counter and sold flour and sugar and coffee to customers who paid with silver from the mines or credit they would settle in the spring. "That girl," he said to anyone who would listen, "digging herself a grave up there in the mountains. Mark my words. First hard freeze, we'll find what's left of her come spring." Dr. Clement Harshaw made his rounds, treating the minor ailments of autumn. A cough here, a sprain there. He charged what the market would bear and recorded his fees in a leather-bound ledger that was his most prized possession. "Juvenile hysteria," he would say when anyone mentioned Marin's warnings. "I diagnosed it myself. Classic presentation. Apocalyptic delusions brought on by the trauma of orphanhood. Science has documented such cases extensively." Agnes Whitaker held court on the porch of the general store, spreading news and gossip with equal enthusiasm. "I heard," she would say, leaning close, "that the girl was seen talking to animals up in the foothills, actually conversing with them, like she thought they could understand her. That's how you know the madness has taken hold. Blood tells. It always tells." Cordelia Braxton managed her late husband's mining interests with the same iron hand she had always used. She did not speak of Marin at all. To speak of her would be to acknowledge that the problem had not been entirely solved, that somewhere in the mountains, the child she had voted to exile was still breathing. Pastor Josiah Fenimore delivered sermons that emphasized the importance of faith over fear, of trusting in divine providence rather than in the words of disturbed children. "The Lord will provide," he thundered from his pulpit. "He has always provided. Those who doubt his providence doubt his very existence." And in the cellar beneath the church, hidden behind a false wall of shelving, Pastor Fenimore had already begun to stockpile supplies. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, canned goods. All of it taken in small quantities from the community relief fund that he administered, diverted so gradually that no one noticed. He told himself this was stewardship, that God provides for his servants so that his servants might continue to serve, that a shepherd must survive in order to save his flock. He did not believe a word of it, but he said the words anyway, because saying them was easier than facing what they covered. Only a few people in Coldwater Ridge paid attention to the signs that Marin had described. Amos Kincaid, noticed that his remaining sheep were growing wool thicker than he had ever seen. He noticed that the geese were flying south 3 weeks earlier than usual. He noticed that the bears had gone into hibernation before the first week of October, which had never happened in his 67 years. He noticed, but he said nothing. Old Bridget Morrigan noticed the same things and more. She noticed the way the squirrels were hoarding with frantic energy. She noticed the color of the sunset, that particular red that the old people in County Clare had always said meant harsh weather coming. "Mark my words," she muttered to herself each evening as she drew her curtains against the darkening sky. "That girl was right, and we're all going to pay for not listening." Klaus Weberman noticed something else. He noticed the frost patterns on his window panes, the way the ice crystals formed in shapes he had not seen since his childhood in Bavaria. In the old country, he told anyone who would listen, such patterns meant a killing winter, the kind that took whole villages. No one listened. November 12th arrived. The sky that morning was the color of a bruise, purple and gray and swollen with something that wanted to fall. By noon, it was falling. Snow. Heavy and wet. Accumulating fast. By evening, 8 inches covered the ground. The wind had risen to 50 miles per hour, driving the snow sideways, reducing visibility to nothing. By midnight, the temperature had dropped from 35 degrees to 5 degrees. The blizzard had begun, and it was not going to stop. In her cave, Maren stood at the entrance and watched the world turn white. She had felt it coming for days, the pressure dropping in her ears, the animals growing quiet, the particular stillness that settles over the land when the land itself is bracing for impact. Now it was here. She pulled the heavy wooden door closed and slid the bolt into place. She added another log to the fire. She checked on Ghost in the adjoining chamber and on the sheep in theirs. Everyone was safe. Everyone was warm. Thistle curled up beside the fire pit, her eyes reflecting the flames. Copper the fox had not appeared at the creek for 3 days now. He had found his own shelter somewhere, his own way of surviving what was coming. She hoped he would make it through. Maren sat down with her back against the stone wall that still held the heat of yesterday's sun. She wrapped her rabbit fur coat around her shoulders and watched the firelight dance on the carved walls of the home she had built with her own hands. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees. She thought of Coldwater Ridge, of the people there, of the children. She thought of Whit Braxton, who had not raised his hand. She thought of old Bridget Morrigan, who had given her salt and believed her. She thought of Amos Kincaid, who had known she was right and said nothing. She thought of Dorothea Creel, who had signed a paper at 2 in the morning while Maren slept in her dead daughter's bed. They had not listened. Now they would learn. "Grandfather," she whispered to the empty room that wasn't empty at all. "I tried to tell them." She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication. She felt only a hollow ache for the people 20 miles south who had not prepared, who were about to learn the lesson that Ezra Ashby had spent his life teaching. The wilderness does not negotiate. It does not give second chances. It does not care whether you are righteous or wicked, young or old, powerful or powerless. It only cares whether you are ready. The winter of 1888 to 1889 came down on Montana territory with a violence that would be remembered for generations. Storm after storm rolled south from Canada, each one colder and more brutal than the last. The snow did not accumulate in inches. It accumulated in feet. The temperature plunged to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks at a time. A sustained, merciless cold that turned metal brittle and froze the moisture inside men's lungs when they breathed too deeply. The wind was constant, a howling presence that never rested, that pushed the cold through every wall and under every door, and into every corner of every room, where people huddled together and prayed for something to change. In Coldwater Ridge, the cattle died first. The herds that had been the foundation of the town's economy died in the draws and coulees, where they had sought shelter from the wind. The animals were too weak from the early snows to forage, too exposed to survive the sustained cold that followed. Amos Kincaid's sheep flock, 400 animals he had spent 40 years building, was reduced to 11 survivors in a single week. The Braxton mining operation, which Cordelia managed with such iron efficiency, could not operate. The equipment froze. The workers could not reach the shafts. The silver that had made the family wealthy remained in the ground, worthless. Then the food ran out. Rutherford Polk's general store, which had seemed adequately stocked in October, was empty by Christmas. The flour was gone, then the salt pork, then the dried beans, then the sugar, then the coffee, then everything else. Families who had entered winter with the casual confidence of people who had always been fed found themselves counting handfuls of cornmeal and rationing water and feeding their children first, while their own stomachs twisted in the dark. The hunters went out and came back with nothing. The deer had moved to lower elevations weeks before. The elk were gone. The rabbits had burrowed so deep that even experienced trappers could not find them. The land that had always provided was providing nothing. And the people who had always taken from it were learning for the first time what it felt like to be refused. Week 1 of the blizzard, 3 miners died trying to walk from the shaft to the bunkhouse. They were found the next morning, frozen solid, less than 100 yards from the door. Week 2, the Henderson baby stopped breathing in the night. The family could not dig a grave in the frozen ground. They wrapped the small body in cloth and placed it in the woodshed, where it would keep until spring. Week 3, Dr. Clement Harshaw ran out of medicine. His leather-bound ledger, filled with the debts that townspeople owed him, became worthless paper. No one had money. No one had credit. No one had anything except hunger and cold and the growing certainty that they were all going to die. Week 4, Whit Braxton came home from checking the perimeter of their property and found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. 12, Cordelia said. Her voice was hollow, in a way Whit had never heard before. 12 of our men are dead. The foreman. 6 miners. 5 from the support crew. 12 men dead. And winter isn't even half over. That same week, Whit made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had gone to the church hoping to find food in the chapel's offering box, anything that might keep his mother standing for another day. The building was cold and dark, the pews covered in frost, the altar bare. But as he turned to leave, he heard something. A sound from below, a scraping, a rustling. He followed the sound to a door behind the pulpit, a door he had never noticed before. It was locked, but the lock was cheap, and hunger makes a person resourceful. He broke it with a candlestick from the altar. The stairs led down into darkness. He lit a match and descended. What he found made his stomach clench. Sacks of flour stacked against the wall, jars of preserved fruit on wooden shelves, dried meat wrapped in cloth, canned goods, salt pork, enough food to feed 25 people for 2 months. All of it hidden beneath the feet of a congregation that was starving. Whit stood in that cellar for a long time. The match burned down to his fingers, and he didn't feel it. He lit another and stood there longer. Pastor Fenimore had been taking from the Community Relief Fund, a little at a time, so gradually that no one noticed. While he preached about divine providence and the testing of faith, he had been building his own private store against the winter he claimed would never come. Whit climbed back up the stairs. He closed the door. He did not replace the broken lock. He did not tell his mother. Not yet. The knowledge was too heavy, too dangerous. And he was 16 years old and still learning which battles a person fights and which ones a person survives. But he remembered. And when the time came to leave Coldwater Ridge, he would remember what to do with that knowledge. In late December, Silas Varn came back. He appeared out of the storm like a ghost made flesh, gaunt and desperate, with frost in his beard and madness in his eyes. He had survived the first weeks of winter by doing things he would never speak of, things that involved other travelers who had been less prepared than he was. Now he stood outside the stone door that Maren had carved into the cliff face, and he remembered his promise. "We'll see how brave you are when you're starving." He was the one starving now. He was the one desperate. He pounded on the door with fists that could barely feel the wood. "Open up!" he shouted. "I know you're in there! Open this door, or I'll break it down!" Inside, Maren woke from sleep. Thistle was already on her feet, hackles raised, growling at the door. Maren reached for her knife. She approached the door slowly, listening to the sounds from outside. The pounding, the shouting, the wind howling behind both. "I told you I'd come back!" Varn screamed. "I told you! Now open this door!" Maren said nothing. She checked the bolt. It was solid. The door was thick. He could not break through, but he kept pounding, kept shouting, kept throwing his weight against the wood until the frame shook. Maren made a decision. She slid the bolt back. She pulled the door open. Silas Varn stumbled forward, off balance from his last assault. His eyes went wide as he found himself facing a 13-year-old girl with a knife in one hand and a snarling dog at her side. "You want in?" Maren said. "Fine. Come in." Varn hesitated. This was not what he had expected. He stepped forward. Thistle lunged. The dog's teeth found his ankle, not biting deep but biting enough to throw him off balance again. Varn stumbled sideways, toward the edge of the shelf that fronted the cave entrance. His foot found ice. His arms windmilled. His body went over the edge. It was not a long fall, perhaps 15 feet to the snow-covered rocks below, but it was enough to break something. Maren heard the crack, heard the scream that followed. She looked over the edge. Varn lay in the snow, clutching his leg, cursing and weeping and cursing some more. His femur was broken. In this cold, with no shelter and no help, a broken femur was a death sentence. Maren could leave him there. No one would ever know. No one would ever care. He had threatened her. He had come back to take what she had built. He deserved whatever happened to him now. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back inside, got her rope, and climbed down to where he lay. "Don't touch me," Varn snarled. "Get away from me." "Shut up," Maren said. "I'm going to splint your leg and drag you to the tree line. After that, you're on your own. You come back here again, ever, and I won't throw the rope." She worked quickly, using branches and strips of cloth to immobilize the broken bone. Varn cursed her the entire time. He called her every name he knew. He threatened her with what he would do when he healed. Maren ignored all of it. She dragged him 300 yards to the edge of the valley, where the trees provided some shelter from the wind. She left him with a small bundle of dried meat, enough to keep him alive for a day or two if he was lucky. Then she walked back to her cave and sealed the door behind her. She had saved the man who came to rob her. She had saved him because she could. Because her grandfather had taught her that the capacity to help is itself a kind of obligation, one that the wilderness enforces without sentiment and without exception. She did not know if Varn would survive. She did not particularly care. But she knew that she had done the right thing. And in the wild, where right and wrong are not abstractions, but matters of life and death, knowing you have done the right thing is sometimes all you have to hold on to. In February, Amos Kincaid died. He died in his bed, which was the only mercy the winter granted him. His son Elias was with him at the end, holding the old man's hand as his breath grew shallow and his eyes grew distant. Before he died, Amos called his son close. "In my coat pocket," he whispered. "The one hanging by the door. There's a letter. You give it to the Ashby girl, if she's alive." Elias nodded, not understanding. The Ashby girl had been sent into the mountains 4 months ago. She was certainly dead. Everyone assumed she was dead. "If she's alive," Amos said again. His voice had the particular urgency of a man who knows he is out of time and has one last thing he needs to accomplish before the clock runs down. "Promise me." His son promised. He took the letter from the coat pocket without reading it and put it in his own pocket, where it would stay unread through the remaining weeks of winter. A message from a dead man to a girl the whole town believed was dead too. 112 people were still alive in Coldwater Ridge when Cordelia Braxton finally broke. It happened at the kitchen table, in the house that her husband had built with silver money, in the chair where she had given orders for 20 years. Whit came in from checking the perimeter. His face was red with cold. His eyes were hollow with hunger. "Mother," he said, "we have to do something." "There's nothing to do. There's nothing left. The girl, the Ashby girl, if she survived." "She didn't survive. No one could survive." "She said she could. She said her grandfather taught her." Cordelia looked at her son, really looked at him, saw the man he was becoming in the shadow of the boy he had been. "Even if she did," Cordelia said, "why would she help us? I was the first to raise my hand. I was the first to vote her out. Everyone knows that. She knows that." "Then let me go find her. Let me ask." "You'll die out there. I'll die in here too. We all will. At least this way. There's a chance." Cordelia was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals because there was not enough wood to keep it blazing. Then Cordelia Braxton, the woman who had raised her hand first, the woman who had never questioned whether she was right about anything in her life, looked at her only surviving son and said in a voice that cracked down the middle like ice on a spring river, "Then go find her. 112 people still alive, 23 already dead. Winter isn't over yet, and now the people who cast Marin out have to decide, die with their pride or live with their shame. What do you think they'll choose? Let me know in the comments." 5 men rode north on the strongest horses left in Coldwater Ridge, which were not strong at all. Whit Braxton rode at the front because he was the one who had spoken and therefore the one who had to lead. Beside him rode Declan Tulloch, 15 years old, the blacksmith's son. The same boy who had once thrown stones at Marin in the streets of town and called her Mountain Rat and told the other children that if they played with her, whatever strangeness she carried would spread to them like disease. Declan had volunteered without being asked and without explaining why. In his saddlebag was a coil of good rope, the last thing his father had made before the forge went cold. Carried north toward a girl he had once tormented, because he did not yet know how to apologize, but he knew he had to do something. 3 other men rode with them, Elias Kincaid, Amos's son, carrying his father's letter in his pocket. 2 miners whose names would be forgotten by history, but whose presence meant that at least someone from the working class of Coldwater Ridge had the courage to ride into the mountains looking for a child. They did not expect to find Marin Ashby alive. They expected to find a small frozen body curled beneath a ledge somewhere, a minor tragedy added to the larger catastrophe. But they had to know. They had to see. Because the alternative was to sit in Coldwater Ridge and wait for the next person to die. And Whit Braxton had decided that he was done waiting. On the 3rd day, following a thin trail of smoke rising from a cliff face they had passed 100 times without ever noticing, they found her. The cave entrance was nearly invisible, a dark gap in the red-gold stone, sheltered beneath an overhang, protected by a wooden door fitted so precisely into the rock that it looked as though it had grown there over centuries rather than being built by a child over weeks. The smoke rose from a crack in the cliff above, a thin, straight line that spoke of a fire burning with steady, controlled efficiency within. Whit dismounted. He walked to the door. He knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. The girl who stood in the doorway should have been dead. She was thin, yes, thinner than she had been in September, but not starving. Her face was wind-burned but healthy. Her dark braided hair was tucked beneath a hood, made from rabbit pelts, stitched together with rawhide. Her hands, resting at her sides, were thick with calluses. Behind her, visible in the warm glow of the fire, the men could see carved stone walls, stacked firewood, bundles of dried meat hanging from wooden pegs, and deeper in the shadows, a gray horse standing in an adjoining chamber, its breath making small clouds in the warm air. Beyond that, the sound of sheep stirring in their own space. A border collie stood beside the girl, alert, but not growling, as though it had decided these visitors were not threats. She had carved a home into the mountain. She had tamed a wild horse. She had gathered a flock. She had survived what should have killed her. Her eyes moved across the group. They paused on Whit. They paused longer on Declan, who stood slightly behind the others, his head lowered. "You came," Marin said. She said it as a statement of fact, the way she might observe that the sun had risen or the snow had fallen. Whit found his voice. "The town is starving. 112 people, mostly women and children. Some of the men went out looking for food and never came back. 23 are already dead." Marin did not respond immediately. She turned and walked back into the cave. She sat down beside the fire. She looked into the flames for a long moment. The men stood outside in the snow, their horses stamping, the cold pressing against them. Whit watched the girl through the open doorway, her small figure outlined by firelight, and he understood that the silence was not confusion or hesitation. It was a decision being made. The hardest kind. The kind where every answer costs something, and there is no choice that does not leave a scar. He waited. They all waited. The wind blew. The smoke rose. Then Marin Ashby stood up, walked to the door, and began to speak. "There is a valley 3 miles east of here. The elk winter there. My grandfather showed it to me years ago. The snow is shallow because the cliffs block the wind. If your hunters go there, they will find game." She paused. "And there are 4 caves in these cliffs, not carved like mine. Natural, large enough to shelter families. I can show you where they are. People can survive there until spring, if they are willing to work." Whit stared at her. 16 years old, exhausted, starving, standing before a 13-year-old girl he had last seen walking alone into a wilderness that should have killed her. "After what we did to you," he said, "you would help us?" Marin's expression did not change. "My grandfather taught me that the wilderness does not care about grudges. It only cares about who is prepared and who is not." She stepped back from the door. "Come inside. Warm yourselves. Then we have work to do." The evacuation of Coldwater Ridge began 3 days after the search party returned. Whit rode back into town on a horse that could barely stand and told the survivors what he had found. Not a frozen body, not a shallow grave. A girl alive in a home she had carved from the mountain with her grandfather's knife. A girl who had stored food and tamed a horse and gathered sheep and built a fire that burned so efficiently the stone itself became a furnace. A girl who, after everything they had done to her, had looked at the men who came begging and said, "Come inside. Warm yourselves." Then we have work to do. Some of them wept when they heard it. Not all of them. Some were too far past weeping, too hollowed out by months of cold and hunger and loss to produce the energy that tears require. But the ones who could still cry did, and the sound of it moved through the remaining houses of Coldwater Ridge, the way wind moves through a canyon, picking up force as it goes. They gathered what they could carry. It was not much. Blankets, a few tools, whatever food remained, which was almost nothing. The women bundled their children in every piece of fabric they could find, layering coats over shawls over curtains torn from windows, wrapping the smallest ones until they looked like parcels being shipped to some warmer place that existed only in their mother's prayers. Maren rode Ghost at the head of the column. She sat straight on the gray mare's back, her rabbit fur coat pulled tight against the February wind, her dark braid hanging over one shoulder. Thistle trotted beside her, occasionally ranging ahead to check the trail, always circling back. Behind her stretched a line of desperate people, perhaps 90 souls, stumbling through snowdrifts that reached their waists, clinging to each other and to horses and to the last reserves of strength that the human body finds when the only alternative to moving forward is dying where you stand. She led them through passes that were invisible beneath the snow, along ridge lines where the wind had scoured the rock bare, down into sheltered valleys where the drifts were shallow enough to walk through without falling. She knew these routes because Ezra had walked them with her, because his voice still lived in her memory, saying this way, not that way, and watch the ridge, little bird. The ridge will tell you where the wind goes. She followed her grandfather's ghost through the mountains, and 90 people followed her. Near the middle of the column, Cordelia Braxton walked with a sack that held everything she had saved from the house. Her face was gaunt, though the winter had aged her by a decade beyond her 42 years. Her hands were raw. Her husband had died in a mining accident. Her foreman had frozen to death. Her empire had collapsed, and the girl leading them to safety was the girl she had voted to send away. When the column reached the cliffs and Maren began assigning families to caves, Cordelia's voice cut through the wind. This child does not have the authority to tell us where to live. 90 people stopped moving. Maren, still mounted on Ghost, turned to look at Cordelia Braxton. The two of them regarded each other across a silence filled with falling snow. Whit stepped between them. Mother. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything he had seen and lost in the past 5 months. This girl survived alone in these mountains through the same winter that killed our cattle and our neighbors and our men. She did it at 13 years old, with a knife and a blanket and nothing else. We had a whole town, and we couldn't manage it. She has the authority. Cordelia looked at her son. She saw in his face something that had not been there in September. A steadiness, a resolve. The expression of a young man who had crossed some invisible line between childhood and whatever comes after, and could not cross back. She opened her mouth to speak. Then she closed it. She picked up her sack and walked toward the cave that Maren had indicated. It was the first time in Cordelia Braxton's life that she had been wrong, and knew it, and chose to act on the knowing instead of burying it. Pastor Josiah Fenimore did not join the evacuation. He stood on the steps of his church as the column assembled, his coat buttoned to his chin, his Bible held against his chest, and watched the people of Coldwater Ridge prepare to follow a child into the wilderness. The same child he had condemned from his pulpit. The same child he had driven out with scripture and righteous fury. The same child whose predictions had come true in every particular, while his own assurances of divine protection had proven to be nothing more than the words of a man who could not admit he was wrong. "I will not follow the devil's servant," he announced to anyone who would listen, though fewer people were listening now than had listened in September. God will provide for the righteous where darkness cannot reach. Dorothea Creel stood at the edge of the departing crowd and looked at Fenimore on his church steps. 3 months ago, she would have stayed silent. 3 months ago, she would have lowered her eyes and gripped her curtain and let another moment pass without speaking. But Dorothea Creel had spent the winter burning her furniture and starving herself so other people's children could eat. The woman who stood here now was not the same woman who had signed that paper in September. She did not argue with him. She did not plead. She looked at Josiah Fenimore the way you look at a door that has been locked from the inside by someone who has thrown away the key. She understood that some people build prisons out of their own pride and then choose to die inside them rather than admit that the walls were never necessary. She turned away and walked into the column. She did not look back. Before the last riders left, Whit Braxton dismounted and returned to the church one final time. He had carried the knowledge of Fenimore's cellar for weeks. The weight of it had sat in his chest like a stone, growing heavier with each person who died, while the pastor preached about divine providence from a pulpit built above a secret store of food. Now, finally, he could do something with that knowledge. He went around to the side, to the cellar door. The lock he had broken weeks ago had been replaced with a new one. Fenimore must have discovered the break-in and assumed it was a desperate townsperson. Whit broke the new lock with a stone. He placed a folded piece of paper on the ground before the open door. On the paper, he had written 5 words: "Food in the cellar for anyone." He did not know if anyone would find it before Fenimore did. He did not know if it would save any lives. But he knew that he had done what he could, and that was all any person could do. He mounted his horse and rode north without looking at Fenimore, who was watching from the window of the church with an expression that Whit did not want to study closely enough to name. The caves that Marin led them to were scattered along a mile of cliff face, natural chambers worn into the sandstone by water and time. They were not carved and smooth like Marin's home. They were rough, irregular, cold, but they were sheltered from the wind. And they were deep enough to hold heat once fires were built. And they were large enough to contain the families that Marin assigned to each one with the quiet competence of someone who had spent months studying the mountain and knew its architecture the way a builder knows the house she designed. Families with the most children received the deepest caves. The elderly and the sick were placed nearest to Marin's own cave, where she could check on them. The able-bodied men were given the most exposed positions because they could endure it, and because their job was not to rest, but to hunt. On the first morning, she sent hunting parties east toward the valley she had promised. They returned that evening with 2 elk and a mule deer. It was the first real meat any of them had eaten in weeks. The women roasted it over fires built against the cave walls, and the fat dripped and sizzled, and the smell of it filled the cold air. Children who had not smiled since Christmas smiled. Mothers who had not slept since January wept into their hands with a relief so large that their bodies did not know how to contain it, except through tears. 3 things happened in the caves that winter that mattered more than the rest. The first was the night the Henderson child almost died. The family's youngest surviving child, a girl of 4, spiked a fever so severe that her skin burned to the touch, and her eyes rolled back, and her small body shook with tremors that made her mother scream for help into the frozen dark. Dorothea Creel reached the Henderson cave first. Cordelia Braxton arrived moments later, carrying a blanket she had taken from her own bedding. The 2 women, who had existed on opposite sides of Coldwater Ridge's social hierarchy for a decade, who had never spoken to each other outside of church, who had nothing in common except that they were both mothers, who knew what it looked like when a child was slipping away, knelt side by side on the stone floor and held the girl while her fever raged. Marin came last. She looked at the child, felt her forehead, listened to her breathing. Then she went out into the night, into the killing cold. She walked along the frozen creek until she found a stand of willow. She stripped bark from the lower branches, carried it back, steeped it in hot water over the fire, and fed the bitter liquid to the girl in small sips until she swallowed enough to make a difference. By morning, the fever had broken. The child was sleeping. Her mother held her against her chest and rocked her and murmured words that were not words at all, but sounds. The primal music of a woman whose child has been returned to her from the edge of something she cannot bring herself to name. Cordelia Braxton sat against the cave wall, exhausted, and watched Maren clean the cup she had used to feed the child. She watched the girl's hands, steady and certain, the hands of someone who had learned to act instead of pray, to prepare instead of hope. And Cordelia felt something shift inside her chest, a rearrangement of something she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it was there. It was recognition, the simple, devastating recognition that she had been wrong, that the girl she had voted to send away was the reason her neighbor's grandchild was still breathing. She did not speak. There were no words for what she felt that would not have sounded hollow. She simply sat and watched, and let the recognition settle into her bones. The second thing was the hunt that almost ended in disaster. Whit led a party of 4 men into the Elk Valley on a clear morning that turned, within hours, into a whiteout. The snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to nothing, and the trails Maren had shown them vanished beneath fresh drifts. They killed an elk, but could not find their way back. They wandered in circles for hours, burning energy they could not afford, their horses stumbling, their bodies stiffening, the white wall of snow pressing in from every direction. Maren saddled Ghost and rode east. She read the wind direction from the angle of snow on the branches. She followed the faint depressions in the snow where hooves had passed hours before. She found them 2 miles from the cliffs, huddled in a stand of pines, half frozen. The elk carcass lashed to a horse that was too exhausted to carry it much farther. Thistle had come with her, and the dog circled the lost party with anxious energy, as though counting them to make sure no one was missing. Maren led them home without a word. That evening, Whit sat down beside her at the entrance to her cave. The stars were out. The storm had passed. Ghost stood behind them, her breath making small clouds in the stillness. "You've saved us twice now," Whit said. "Once when you told us the truth. Once when you pulled us out of the snow." Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Whit would remember for the rest of his life. "My grandfather used to say that saving people doesn't need to be remembered. But if you do remember, remember it right. Remember that you saved yourselves too. You saved yourselves when you chose to listen." Whit nodded. He did not speak again. They sat in silence, and for the first time since September, the silence between them felt like something built rather than something broken. The third thing was Declan Tulloch and the rope. He found Maren outside her cave on a morning when the light was thin and gray and the air tasted of iron. He held the coil of rope in both hands. The rope his father had made in the forge that had gone cold. The last piece of craftsmanship the blacksmith had produced before the winter took his livelihood and nearly took his life. "For you," Declan said. His voice was rough. He was 15 years old, and the words were costing him something that he did not fully understand, but could feel in his chest. A tightness, a heat, the physical sensation of pride being dismantled and something better being built in its place. "Good rope, my pa made it." Maren took the coil. She turned it in her hands, testing the weight, the braid. It was good rope. Strong. Well made. The kind of rope that lasts. "Thank you," she said. Both of them understood that the word carried more than its surface. It carried the memory of stones thrown in the street and a voice saying, "Mountain Rat," and a girl who had not flinched. It carried the distance between who Declan had been and who he was becoming, measured not in miles, but in the simple act of offering something useful to someone he had once tried to diminish. "I want to learn," Declan said. "What you know, how you survived. Teach me." Marin looked at the boy who had thrown stones at her. She studied his face the way she studied everything, with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to read what was real and ignore what was not. She saw in his eyes something genuine, something that could be trusted because it made no claim to be anything other than what it was. "Stand up," she said. "First lesson. Nobody needs to kneel to learn." Declan stood, and the distance between who he had been and who he would become closed by another measure. Not fully, not yet, but enough to make the rest of the journey possible. Dorothea Creel became Marin's unofficial second-in-command, though neither of them would have used that term. Dorothea organized the families, mediated disputes over firewood and sleeping arrangements, made sure the children were fed and the elderly were warm, ensured that the small daily crises of 90 people living in stone chambers did not escalate into the kind of conflict that could fracture a community already held together by nothing but necessity and the quiet authority of a 13-year-old girl. Dorothea never said, "I'm sorry." Not once, not in words. Instead, she went without food so that Marin could eat. She stayed awake through the night so that Marin could sleep. She tore apart her own wool coat and knitted a pair of gloves small enough for a child's hands and left them on the ledge outside Marin's cave without a note or explanation. Marin found the gloves in the morning. She picked them up. She recognized the wool. She knew whose coat it had come from and what it had cost the woman to unmake it. She put the gloves on. She wore them every day for the rest of the winter. She never mentioned them, and Dorothea never asked whether she had found them. Some apologies are too large for language. They can only be spoken in the vocabulary of sacrifice, in small acts repeated daily, in the steady accumulation of deeds that say what words cannot. Dorothea Creel apologized to Marin Ashby every day for the rest of her life, and Marin received each apology in silence, and the silence between them became something neither of them had expected. It became peace. 89 people survived. 23 had died in Coldwater Ridge before the evacuation. One more died during the journey north, an elderly man whose heart simply stopped as he climbed a ridgeline in the snow. His body was buried in a snow grave along the trail, marked with stones that would be uncovered in spring. But 89 lived, including all 12 children under the age of 10. They lived because a girl who had been cast out as a liar had carved a home from stone and then opened her door to the people who had put her out. They returned to Coldwater Ridge in May, when the snow had pulled back from the valley floor and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud and the creek was running high with meltwater. The town was a ruin. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow. Fences were down. The general store's windows were broken, and birds had been nesting inside since March. It looked like a place that had been abandoned for years rather than months, as though the winter had aged it forward by a decade in a single season. They found Pastor Josiah Fenimore in April, when a warm spell melted enough snow to reveal the church door. He was inside, seated in the front pew, frozen in a posture that might have been prayer or might have been surrender. His Bible was open on his lap. His eyes were closed. Whit Braxton was part of the group that found him. He looked at the cellar door, standing open, the shelves inside, empty, the sacks and jars consumed. Fenimore had eaten every morsel he had hoarded, alone in the cold, with no one to share it and no one to know. And it had not been enough. Dorothea Creel stood behind Whit and looked at the empty cellar. "He ate alone," she said softly. "Every bite alone. and Maren shared everything she had and lived. No one answered. There was nothing to add. The cellar told its own story, and the story needed no commentary. The gathering was held in late May in the open air, because no one could bring themselves to enter the church. They assembled on the grass, where the cattle had grazed in better years. 89 souls standing in sunlight that felt foreign on skin that had forgotten what warmth from above felt like. Elias Kincaid approached Maren first. He was Amos's son, and he carried in his pocket the letter his father had written before he died. He had not opened it until the morning of the gathering, when something told him the time had finally come. He handed the letter to Maren. "My father wanted you to have this," he said. He wrote it in February. He knew he wasn't going to make it. Maren took the letter. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was fragile, softened by the moisture of being carried through snow and storm and the long weeks of waiting. She read it aloud, and her voice did not waver, though what the letter contained was enough to break a person far older and harder than she was. "Maren," she read, "I am writing this because I know I will not make it through the winter. I want you to know that I believed you. I always believed you. I saw every sign you saw. The sheep growing wool too thick, the geese flying south too early, the bears sleeping too soon. I saw it all, but I didn't speak up. I was afraid of Fenimore, afraid of the town turning on me. I lived 67 years on this land and told myself I was a self-reliant man. But it turns out I was the biggest coward of all. Your grandfather Ezra would be ashamed of me, and I am ashamed of myself. If you are reading this, it means you survived. I am not surprised. You are Ezra Ashby's granddaughter. This land wasn't worthy of you, but I hope you will forgive it anyway, because the land, unlike the mountain, doesn't know any better. Only people know better, and we chose wrong. Amos Kincaid." Maren folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Heavy with the weight of words spoken too late by a man who had understood his own failure only at the end. Then she spoke. "My grandfather told me once that the mountains do not judge," she said. "They do not care if you are rich or poor, wicked or righteous, young or old. They only care whether you are prepared." She looked at Dorothea, at Cordelia, at Declan. "He said that people are different, that people judge and hate and fear what they don't understand." She touched the pocket where the letter rested. "But he also said that people can learn, that they can change." She paused. The sound of the creek filled the silence. Mr. Kincaid knew the right thing. He didn't do it. He called himself a coward. I call him human. Her eyes moved across the assembled faces. 89 people who owed their lives to a girl they had sent away to die. "We are all afraid," she said, "but being afraid and still doing the right thing. That is what courage is. Mr. Kincaid didn't get there in time, but you still can." She stopped speaking for a moment. When she continued, her voice was steady but soft. "I do not forgive what you did. Forgiveness is not something I know how to give. But I am glad you lived. I am glad the children lived. And if you want to learn what I know, how to read the land, how to prepare for what is coming, how to survive when the world turns cold, I will teach you." Her voice steadied. "My grandfather said the mountains have no mercy, but we are not mountains. We can choose to be different." She stopped speaking. The crowd stood motionless. No one clapped. No one cheered. What she had said did not invite applause. It invited something quieter and more difficult. It invited reflection. As the gathering broke apart and people began the slow work of assessing what remained of their town and their lives, Cordelia Braxton approached Maren. "I was the first to raise my hand. I want everyone to know that. I voted to send you away because I was afraid that if you were right, then everything I believed about how the world works, that hard work is enough, that the people in charge know best, that respectability will keep you safe. All of it was wrong." She paused. "I was wrong. About all of it." Maren looked at the woman who had led the vote against her. "I know," she said. "It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. But it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement sometimes is where the possibility of healing begins." Dorothea Creel came next. She stood before Maren with tears streaming down her face and her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent at confession. "I signed the paper," she said. "The paper that Pastor Fenimore brought to my door. I signed it while you slept in my bed, under a quilt I made for my own daughter who died." Her voice broke. "I was the one who kept you longest. I was the one who cared for you most. And I was the one who betrayed you most completely. Because I knew you were right. And I signed anyway." She did not ask for forgiveness. She knew she had no right to ask. "There is no excuse for what I did," she said. "There is only what I have tried to do since. And it will never be enough." Maren looked at the woman who had taught her to sew, who had let her sleep in a real bed, who had called her daughter in everything but name, and then signed a paper that sent her into the wilderness. "The gloves," Maren said. Dorothea looked up. "What?" "The gloves you made, from your coat. You left them on my ledge." Dorothea nodded, fresh tears falling. "I found them," Maren said. "I wear them every day." It was not forgiveness, but it was something. A thread connecting two people who had been on opposite sides of a great wrong and had found their way to a place where the sides no longer mattered. Coldwater Ridge was rebuilt, but it was never the same town. The mining industry that had sustained it was broken. The cattle were dead. The old certainties were gone. The community that emerged from the ashes of that winter was smaller, more cautious, more attentive to the land and the signals it provided. They diversified their food sources. They built sturdier shelters. They stockpiled provisions. And they listened to the animals, to the weather, to the children who sometimes knew things that adults did not. Maren did not return to live among them. She stayed in her cliff home, expanding it over the years into a network of chambers that could shelter 30 people if the need arose again. She became a guide for those crossing the mountains, a teacher for those who wanted to learn the old skills, a living reminder that the wilderness demanded respect, and that respect began with paying attention. She never married, but she was never alone. Old Bridget Morrigan did not survive to see the second spring after the Great Winter. She died in March of 1890 in one of the caves, surrounded by the children she had helped care for through the long months of cold. Her last words were in Irish, a blessing she had learned from her grandmother in County Clare. But before she died, she told Maren something that the girl would carry with her for the rest of her life. "In Ireland," Bridget said, her voice barely a whisper, "we have a saying. The land remembers those who listen to it. You listened, child. You listened when no one else would. The land will remember you long after the rest of us are forgotten." Maren buried her beside the stream, in a spot where wild roses would bloom in summer. She marked the grave with a stone from Ireland that Bridget had carried across an ocean and a continent, a piece of County Clare that would rest forever in Montana soil. Klaus Webermann became one of Maren's first students after Declan. The German miner had recognized the signs of the killing winter because he had seen them before in Bavaria when he was a boy. He had tried to warn people and been ignored, just as Maren had been ignored. That shared experience created a bond between them that did not require many words. He learned to read the Montana mountains the way he had once read the Bavarian Alps. And when he returned to mining, He taught every man in his crew to watch the animals, to feel the pressure in their ears, to trust the land more than they trusted their own assumptions. Years later, when a spring flood threatened to destroy the rebuilt mining operation, it was Klaus who recognized the signs 3 days before the water rose. He evacuated every man. Not a single life was lost. When people asked him how he knew, his answer was always the same. "A girl taught me," he would say. "A girl who listened when no one else would." Dorothea Creel lived another 7 years after the Great Winter. Every autumn, when the aspens turned gold and the air carried the first bite of cold, she walked north to the cliffs and visited Maren. She brought bread and yarn. Maren provided fire and silence. They sat together in the cave, Dorothea knitting, Maren watching the sky. And the quiet between them was not the quiet of things unsaid. It was the quiet of two people who had found a way to exist beside each other that did not require the language of forgiveness or the performance of reconciliation. It required only presence, only showing up, only the steady, repeated act of climbing a trail to sit beside someone you once failed and letting the sitting speak for itself. When Dorothea died in 1896, Maren dug her grave with her own hands. She buried her beside a stand of aspens at the edge of the valley, where the morning light came through gold, and the wind made music in the leaves. She carved a small shelf into the wall of her cave, at eye level near the entrance. She placed Dorothea's knitting needles on it. They stayed there for 53 years. Declan Tulloch became Maren's first and most devoted student. He spent months in the mountains learning to read the land, to build shelter, to track and trap and forage. He absorbed everything she taught him with the hunger of someone making amends. Not through apology, but through transformation. He became the most respected mountain guide in the Montana Territory, and when anyone asked who had taught him, his answer never varied. "A girl," he would say, 13 years old. The whole town called her a liar. She was the only one telling the truth. Children from Coldwater Ridge came to learn. First a handful, then dozens over the years. They called themselves Maren's students, and they carried her teachings across the territory and beyond. The phrase, "listening to the animals," entered the language of the Montana rangelands and stayed there for generations, spoken with a quiet respect that carried in it the memory of what had happened to those who refused to listen. Whit Braxton never left the area. He rebuilt his family's operation on a smaller scale, ran fewer cattle, built better shelters, kept a winter store that could sustain his family for 6 months, regardless of what the weather did. He visited Maren regularly, not as often as Dorothea, but steadily, a presence in her life that was neither friendship nor obligation, but something in between. The bond of two people who had been on opposite sides of a great wrong and had found their way to a place where the sides no longer mattered. His mother, Cordelia, lived to be 71. She never spoke publicly about the winter again after the gathering in May. But she did one thing that those who knew her considered the most remarkable act of her life. She established a fund, drawn from what remained of the Braxton estate, that paid for the education of any child in the county who wanted to learn but could not afford it. She named it the Ashby Fund. She did not ask Maren's permission. She did not announce it with ceremony. She simply did it. Quietly. The way she had once raised her hand to send a child away. Except now, the hand was building instead of destroying. Thistle died in the autumn of 1902. The border collie was 14 years old, ancient for a dog. Her muzzle had gone white. Her legs could no longer carry her on the long walks she had once loved, but her eyes still watched Maren with the same devotion they had shown since that first winter when they had survived together. On her last morning, Thistle crawled to the entrance of the cave and lay down in a patch of sunlight. Maren sat beside her, stroking the soft fur behind her ears, speaking quietly about the things they had done together. "You were there when no one else was," Maren said. "You stayed when everyone left. You kept me warm when the world was cold." Thistle's tail moved once, weakly, and then was still. Maren buried her beside Ezra's grave, in the plot behind the cabin where she had lived as a child. She marked the spot with a flat river stone and carved 2 words into its surface. "Good girl." She walked back to the cliff alone for the first time in 13 years. Copper, the fox, was seen in the valley for many years after the Great Winter. He never let Maren touch him, but he never stopped appearing at the creek on autumn mornings, watching her from 15 feet away, with eyes that seemed to recognize her as something other than a threat. When he finally stopped appearing, Maren did not know if he had died or simply moved on. But she chose to believe that somewhere in the mountains, his descendants were still watching the sky and storing food too early, and knowing things that humans refused to know. The animals always knew. That was what Ezra had taught her. And they were always right. Maren Ashby lived in her cliff home for 61 years. She passed in the winter of 1949, at the age of 74, on a night when the snow was falling gently, and the fire in her stone pit had burned down to embers that glowed the color of the sandstone walls around them. She died in the home she had built with her own hands when she was 13 years old, in the place she had chosen when no one else would choose her. She was buried beside her grandfather, in the grave she had dug with his knife when she was 11. The knife, with its worn oak handle, was passed to Declan Tulloch's daughter, who passed it to hers. A chain of knowledge and memory, link by link, stretching forward from a canyon where an 11-year-old girl had buried the man who taught her everything, and then walked into the world to teach it to everyone else. The cliff home still stands. It is protected now as a historical site, maintained by descendants of the students Maren taught. Visitors come from across the country to walk through the carved chambers, to stand in the room where Ghost once sheltered, to sit beside the fire pit and feel the warmth that the stone still holds on cold days, as though the mountain itself remembers what happened here and refuses to let it go. They come to understand how a child survived what should have killed her and then chose to save the people who had tried to let her die. They come to stand in the presence of something that cannot be fully explained by survival skills or frontier toughness or any of the practical words we use to describe what Maren Ashby did. Because what she did was not merely practical, it was moral. It was the decision, made by a 13-year-old girl sitting alone beside a fire in a cave she had carved from stone, to extend her hand to the people who had slapped it away. Not because they deserved it, not because she had forgiven them, but because she could. And because her grandfather had taught her that the capacity to help is itself a kind of obligation, one that the wilderness enforces without sentiment and without exception. The principle of earth-sheltered housing that Maren used, maintaining a constant temperature of approximately 54 degrees through the thermal mass of the earth itself, is now recognized by modern architects and engineers as one of the most efficient forms of passive climate control ever developed. What Ezra Ashby learned from his grandfather in the caves of Cornwall and passed down to Maren in the mountains of Montana has been validated by decades of scientific research. The old ways were not superstition. They were physics. They were survival. They were knowledge earned through generations of living close to the earth and paying attention to what it was trying to say. Above the entrance to the cave, carved into the sandstone in letters that Maren added sometime in the years following the Great Winter, is an inscription that visitors often photograph. The letters are rough, unevenly spaced, cut into the stone by the same hands that built the walls and the door and the fire pit and everything else. They read, "The ridge told me I told you. Now we all know. And in the pocket of the coat Marin Ashby was wearing when she died in 1949, folded so many times that the creases had worn through the paper and the words were barely legible, they found a letter. A letter written by a 67-year-old sheep rancher named Amos Kincaid, who had known the truth and been too afraid to speak it, who had watched a child walk away into the wilderness and done nothing but hand her a bag of supplies and weep. She had carried that letter for 61 years. Perhaps that was her version of forgiveness. Not a word spoken. Not a debt pardoned. But the act of keeping. Of holding on to the voice of a man who had failed her, refusing to let it be forgotten. Carrying it against her heart through 6 decades of Montana winters, as though to say, I heard you. You spoke too late and too quietly and from too far away. But I heard you. The mountain does not judge. The mountain does not forgive. The mountain simply stands and remembers and waits for the next winter to come. But Marin Ashby wasn't a mountain. She was a girl, and then a woman, who chose, again and again, through every season of a long and solitary life, to be something the mountain could never be. She chose to be merciful. And mercy, unlike stone, does not erode. It does not crack in the frost or crumble in the rain. It holds, year after year, generation after generation. It holds the way good rope holds, the way carved stone holds, the way a memory holds when it is carried close enough to the heart to become part of the beating itself. The ridge told her. She told them. Now we all know. The story of Marin Ashby ends here. But her lesson doesn't. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. And if you have a story in your own family, someone who believed something true when no one else would listen and was proven right, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Every story matters, even the ones we almost forgot. The end.